kinds of connective tissues, and a major theme is we're going to see how they're constructed affects their function, how shape affects function, how anatomy affects physiology. The first one I want to introduce is the only embryonic connective tissue that I have to show you. This is one that is composed, it's called mesenchyme, and it's composed of stem cells. All these are various kinds of stem cells, and they can basically become almost any other kind of tissue. You find this in embryos. This could become blood, or even muscle, or bone, or cartilage, or a general connective tissue. The only reason I even want to put this one there is I occasionally do mention the word mesenchyme as a source for some of these other tissues. You will hear that occasionally. So it's undifferentiated. These are very generalized cells. There's usually not a lot of fibers in this particular kind of tissue, just a modest amount. It's still developing into what ultimately becomes. The rest of the connective tissues will be so-called adult or mature connective tissues. These are ones that are fully functioning in their normal capacity. First one of these is areolar connective tissue. This one is widespread in the body. It's in the general category called a loose connective tissue. So, if we look at its organization, it has scattered fibers, fairly widely spaced. So lots of ground substance in between, lots of liquid material in between. Fibers of various natures. Some of these are collagen, some of these are elastic. It has a few cells scattered into it. So here are some of the cells. So we've got some cells, and there are various types. The only cell type I would like you to know for this tissue is fibroblast. So that's on your list of things to know. Fibroblast makes something. What do you think a fibroblast makes?
Fibers.
Fibers, yes, it secretes the fibers. And that underscores the idea that matrix is secreted or made by the cells that are around it. But notice the cells are not all touching one another. They're widely spaced. Lots of matrix, characteristic of most connective tissues. Not all, but most. This one's widespread in our body. One of the places where we find is underneath our skin. So not part of our skin, but underneath our skin. And it allows for loose attachment. If we wrote a function down, the function might be loose attachment. That sounds kind of odd, like an oxymoron or loose connection. But this is what allows our skin to kind of flow or flex or slide over underlying muscles or bones or other organs as we're moving our bodies. Or allows the skin, to stretch and flex. There's a limited amount of the way it can move over underlying materials. There's this constraint to that. It does attach, it does connect, but it's not real tight. And that helps to allow for movement. Get widespread in our bodies. Another widespread tissue that's kind of into this general loose category is adipose tissue. This one's a little bit, it doesn't have a lot of fibers, just like the last one does, kind of widely scattered. But it's a little bit atypical for most connective tissues because here there's not a whole lot of matrix. Still more than epithelial tissues, but it probably has some of the least matrix of all the connective tissues. This one is primarily composed of some rather large cells called adipocytes or adipocyte. Cyte, what is that? C-Y-T-E, what's that always refer to? Cell, yes. That is a root that means cell. And so literally this is an adipose cell. And it's mostly consists of a big vacuole, a big storage area inside the cell, which stores fats. Yeah, fats, oils, triglycerides are the main kind of thing that gets stored in there. So obviously one major function of this tissue is nutrient storage. Perhaps we don't value fat tissue in our society a whole lot, but there's a lot of benefits to it. One is a nutrient storage area. It's actually a fairly compact way of storing. We don't store carbohydrates in large amounts in our body. That would take up a lot more room. It's a much more compact way of storing energy. So nutrient storage. What else would adipose tissue function as?
It coats organs to protect them.
Ah, that's a very good one. It pads and protects. So it provides cushioning. Anything else?
Insulation.
Insulation, thermal regulation. Doesn't matter how skinny you are, you have a pretty good fat layer just underneath your skin. And we'll learn more about that when we get the integumentary system in the second unit of this course. Everybody always has a pretty good thick layer of fat in there. Provides for some thermal regulatory abilities. It does provide some structure and shape, and it was mentioned before about protection. An interesting example of that is found around your kidneys. Anybody ever heard of the disease floating kidney before? Ever heard that phrase, floating kidney, or maybe even know someone who had floating kidneys? Well, it turns out that your kidneys have a really big chunk of fat around them. Even if you're fairly thin, there's a pretty big chunk of fat. Some of you may have had the good fortune to be able to dissect a cat or maybe a mammal in high school, and if you did, there was a huge chunk of fat around each of the kidneys, big old chunk of fat. We have that too. That holds the kidneys in place. It kind of anchors them, protects them, pads them, holds them in place. If a person loses a lot of weight, or really a lot of weight, that pad of fat can disappear if you lose enough weight. And then what happens is the kidneys actually slip downwards in your abdominal cavity, they actually fall down. And the tube that drains those, the ureter, gets a kink in it. You know, a garden hose, what happens if you get a sharp bend in the garden hose and it kinks and you can't get any water flow to it? Well, the same thing happens in the ureter. It actually sort of gets a kink in it or bend in it, it impacts urine flow, and that can cause problems. All because of lack of a fat source, an adipose tissue source in that particular area. Again, emphasizing the idea of pads, protects, provides shape, structure, has a major function. Questions? The next couple of connective tissues are not what we call loose, but they'll have the name dense in them. Dense meaning a dense array of kinds of fibers in there. This is dense regular, and in dense regular, what we see is a lot of collagen fibers all arranged in parallel. And they are very tight, they're very dense, as the name suggests. We find these especially in tendons and ligaments. They form a very strong connection anchoring bone to bone or muscle to bone. We'll learn which one is which later. That's not really relevant at this point. Almost like rope-like attachments to anchor muscles to bones. They have very good tensile strength. They resist pulling, like monofilament of fishing line. Of course, they can be deformed easy. They wouldn't be good to support something with weight on top of them. But they resist pulling in one direction very well. These are very strong attachment. Again, resist pulling in one direction. This is mostly collagen fibers. All are mostly collagen fibers. So it's not a huge amount of stretchability. And you see fibroblasts in here again. Not a lot of cells, not a lot of blood vessels in this one. These tissues repair slowly. Those of you who've had maybe an ACL tear, anterior cruciate ligament tear, that's made up of this kind of tissue. Probably any sort of sprain would involve ligament damage or tendon damage. Requires a relatively long road to recovery. Slow because of the little connective tissues. We'll talk more about that when we get to joints, more about those kind of things. The next kind of tissue we're going to call dense irregular. What's similar to the last tissue? What's similar is lots of collagen fibers. Again, there's some fibroblasts in there that are secreting the fibers. But notice there's a lot of fibers, but they're all arranged in different directions. So if we compare the ideas of dense irregular here to areolar here, again, both a random arrangement of fibers, but in dense irregular, there's a lot of fibers. In areolar, there's relatively few fibers. Or if we compare dense irregular here to dense regular here, we see a difference of fibers parallel, tightly arranged, or running in different directions. So both of them have dense arrays, but they run in different directions. And again, we get a little bit of a change in function. This tends to resist tension or pulling in a lot of different directions. Tendons and ligaments just resist pulling in one direction. They're very strong, but they tend to resist pulling in only one direction. They're designed to only withstand forces that occur in one direction. That's normally what happens with muscles. This we see in the dermis of the skin. It's very tough. It keeps the skin from being ripped very easily or cut very easily. We'll talk more about skin damage and dermis when we get to the integument, but it tends to be pretty strong. I mean, if you think about what leather is, real leather from an animal, real leather is dermis of a skin. It's a very tough substance as far as used like for a clothing substance, shoes, or bags or purses or something. It's very tough. It resists being cut or ripped apart, fairly or torn apart pretty easily. It's almost armor-like because of that. Again, this is a tough kind of tissue. Questions? Elastic is our last general kind of connective tissue, meaning widespread in the body. And elastic connective tissue differs from the previous ones in the kind of fiber that it has. It is composed heavily of elastic fibers, very stretchable fibers. And we see that in areas where we need a lot of stretching or a lot of areas that get stretched and have to recoil back to their original shape. The place we're seeing here is in an artery. In fact, this is the largest artery of the body that you're seeing here, the aorta. This is the main artery leading out from the heart. And you guys are familiar with the concept of blood pressure, I think. And what's normal blood pressure for a person?
Like
120 over 80 or something like that. Yeah, that's about normal. It's expressed as two numbers. And that's because your blood pressure varies depending on whether the heart is contracting or whether it's relaxed. And so when it's contracting, when it's pushing, what happens is you get higher blood pressure, and that wall of the artery actually expands open a little bit. The pressure actually pulls it open. And then when pressure is relaxed, when the heart quits contracting, it kind of returns back to its original shape. And that artery has to expand and contract, 60 times a minute, 365 days a year, 75 years of your life. It's going to do that every time. It cannot wear out. It has to be able to keep that resiliency, that elasticity, that recoil ability every single time. If you don't, if it gets expanded out, you can get what's called an aneurysm. If it expands out and won't contract back again, that's another story for a later time. But that's elastic connective tissue. Very stretchable.
What about cartilage?
Cartilage, there are some kinds of elastic cartilage, and we'll get to that in a minute. And that is coming up here in the next couple of slides too. There's multiple kinds of cartilage, and some of it's very stretchable elastic as well.
Would that be dense or loose?
It's something different. It's not in the category of either one of those. So we've got some kind of loose connective tissues which are sort of general everywhere in the body, some dense connective tissues which are kind of generalized and everywhere in the body, and we've got some specialized ones. We generally consider cartilage, bone, and blood as kind of the specialized ones.
Okay.
It's a good question.
Would elastic be considered dense?
Elastic is generally a dense connective tissue. Yeah. So dense would be dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic.
Gotcha.
Although you can have, and realize there can be gradations between some of these as well. More questions? Let's go on to some of these special connective tissues now. We've got cartilage. Cartilage is a typical connective tissue with lots of matrix. There are fibers present, and there are cells present. The cells are called chondrocytes. Chondros means cartilage, cyte means cell, and they are producing the matrix of cartilage. The ground substance is kind of a quasi-watery to rubbery or gel-like material. It's fairly compression resistant, so this is stronger than some of the other tissues, particularly resisting compression. But we're going to differentiate three kinds of cartilage, and they're going to vary according to the kind of matrix they have. Hyaline cartilage has relatively few fibers. It tends to be smooth, slippery on the surface. We find it on the end of joints. So like in your elbow joint, you have a nice slippery cartilage on one side and a nice slippery cartilage on the bone on the other side. They slide up against one another. That way there's very little friction. It's a very smooth surface. We also see it a lot in embryos, and talk more about that when we get up to skeletal systems a little bit later. If we add a lot of collagen to it, we make fibrocartilage. And this is much stronger. Fibrocartilage differs in it has lots of collagen fibers. It tends to be more compression resistant. It tends to be stronger. We see it, for example, making up the intervertebral discs. They support a lot of weight. You don't want a lot of compression on those. You don't want them to be squeezed or deformed heavily by a lot of weight. So fibrocartilage, we've added more collagen fibers, and now we've made it relatively strong. Still has the same chondrocytes in it, still producing those fibers, ground substance around them. Elastic. As its name suggests, instead of having collagen fibers, it has lots of elastic fibers. So this is an area that forms fairly strong support, makes a relatively rigid structure, but it can flex and bend. The pinna of the external ear flaps are made up of elastic cartilage. It has definitive shape, discrete shape, but yet you can flex, you can bend, and it returns it back to its original shape. Your epiglottis. Epiglottis is the flap that covers the trachea. It's what prevents food from getting down into your lungs, into your respiratory system. And so, it's sitting in there, and it goes either, closes or up, or closes or up, depending upon whether you're swallowing food or whether you're breathing. And so it flips up and down quite a bit. And there's a little bendable joint associated with it. It's made of this elastic cartilage as well. It's got a bendable area that it can sort of flex and bend and work just fine there. Questions?
Is it the fibrocartilage that absorbs shock for your...
It's pretty good shock absorbing, yeah, particularly for, in the intervertebral discs. It will deform a little bit under compression, like I say when a person is jumping up and down or maybe lifting a heavy weight or something like that. But won't deform a whole lot. Yeah, it's pretty strong. It can work as shock absorber. The bones themselves can work as shock absorbers as well. Your bones actually can flex and bend a little bit with weight or with force on them as well. Again, and we'll talk more about bones later, but again, depending on, not all bones are the same, and some of them are more or less mineralized, some of them are more or less collagen fibers, so some of them can bend or flex a little bit more than others. More questions?
So, what about the
Oh, where do you find hyaline cartilage? You find at the ends of bones where there's freely articulating joints.
So they bend too?
There's a little more flex with those. Another place is where the ribs are at. So on our skeleton right here, your ribs aren't bone all the way around. Where you see this clearish yellow area is hyaline cartilage. And it's flexible. Your ribs are not like a fixed iron cage. They actually move. If you breathe, you can feel them moving outward and upward. If you take a big deep breath in. And they're actually bending right at these places here. So hyaline cartilage does allow for some bending. It's a little softer, a little more deformable kind of cartilage. Deformable, think about when a baby is born, it makes up a lot of the embryo. It allows the baby to change shape a little bit going through the birth canal. A number of different places. And we'll talk more about some properties of skeletal tissues, bone and cartilage when we get into skeletal system, second and two. More questions? Talk about bone just for a minute. Bone is going to be the hardest and strongest of all the connective tissues. This is the one that's capable of bending or flexing the least. It has a lot of collagen fibers in it, but the difference is its ground substance is mineralized. So it has a very hard ground substance to it, very rigid ground substance. It supports weight better than any other material, connective tissue material we have. And again, we'll talk more about that when we get up to the skeletal system, bone tissue a little bit later. What do you think osteocytes are? Those are bone cells, yes. So I'd like you to be familiar, at least now, with the term osteocyte. This is just a cell in bone tissue. Yes, bone is a living tissue. If you cut a living bone, it will bleed profusely, actually. It's got lots of blood vessels. It's got lots of different kinds of live cells. They are inside all that bony material. They need oxygen. They give off waste. They respond to hormones, all kinds of things. We'll talk about that interesting story again a little bit later. But that's just a quick introduction. Again, it has a strong mineral matrix. And again, its matrix is often determining the function of these different kinds of tissues.
So like if you cut a bone and it bleeds, it's bleeding actual blood, not like the marrow that's inside.
Oh, it's actual blood, yes. And now there could be some marrow leaking out as well. But yeah, there are blood vessels that actually perforate into the bones. And I'll bring in some real human bones later when we get to that. And I'll show you there's little holes in the bone where you can see the blood vessels actually enter inside the bone. Question? Yes?
What was it called before?
What, you didn't quite get that?
A chondrocyte?
A chondrocyte is a cartilage cell. So that's a cell in cartilage tissue. And again, maybe if nothing else, that introduces the word, the roots chondros is meaning cartilage, and maybe osteo is referring to bone. So when we talk about other terms or structures that have chondros or osteo as part of their roots in their name, familiar with the idea of cartilage versus bone. You know, perichondrium would be a membrane around a cartilage piece. Periosteum would be a membrane around a bone, for example. Blood is our last connective tissue, and blood, we have, looks like we've got some terms here: plasma, red blood cell, and white blood cell. Don't have a lot of clicker questions today, unless we've got some time at the end, but we do have one right here. And you should, let's see if you know a little bit about, try to figure out what you're looking at here. Actually, everybody should be able to figure this one out. Which one of those three, plasma, red blood cell, or white blood cell, we best described as matrix of the blood? I've got a bunch of images to show you at the end of this if we have time, and I think we're going to have time. And that'll be a bunch of clicker questions at the end if we get to them. If not, I'll show them during the review section. Otherwise, I don't have a lot of clicker questions today. Be a lot at the end if we do it. They'll all be at the end together if we get to it. Okay, let's see here. Which one is matrix? You guys chose on this one. You chose good, mostly A, and let's see a little bit better. But remember, matrix is defined as the acellular, non-cellular component of a tissue. So we got things labeled red blood cell, white blood cell, so we can eliminate those as matrix, because matrix is non-cellular, is acellular. So some of the cells that make up blood are red blood cells, white blood cells. The matrix is plasma. What's distinctive about it is there are no fibers. Now maybe clotted blood would be different, but normal blood has no fibers. It just has ground substance. The matrix is only ground substance, and the ground substance is plasma. Because of that, it imparts the special property to this tissue of being liquid, fully able to flow. Now, most of us know that red blood cells transport oxygen. White blood cells do what?
Fight off disease.
They fight diseases. I don't have platelets up here. Platelets might be involved in clotting. And you might be thinking, those are kind of some different functions. What's the common functional theme to blood tissue? And the common functional theme is the ability to transport things. It's liquid. So it can transport oxygen to target tissues. It can transport waste away from areas. It can transport nutrients to things. It can transport white blood cells to sites of infection, or platelets to sites of injury to clot up that wound, that injury. or transport hormones to particular target areas. Because it can flow, because it's liquid, it can do all that, and that's in part by its anatomy. With no fibers, it can flow, it can move, it's a liquid, and now it can transport things. It's one of two major liquid tissues, well, maybe at least two or three. We've got lymph and maybe cerebrospinal fluid and a few other things, but it's probably the most important of the liquid tissues, again, transporting things in the body. Questions?
What
Yes?
is the function of red blood cells?
They transport oxygen. They carry oxygen. They have hemoglobin, which carries oxygen. They have some other functions too. That's probably the major one that you need to know for now, anyway. They can help regulate pH, kind of indirectly a little bit of CO2, and a lot of CO2 gets in the plasma itself. 4 tissues left. 3 of them on muscles, then just 1 tissue in the nervous, general nervous category. Muscular tissue, we recognize 3 kinds of muscle tissue. The cells that they have different shapes. As a brief overview of that, smooth muscle cells and smooth muscle tissue are what's described as spindle-shaped. That is, they are thick in the middle and kind of pointed on either end. That's a smooth muscle cell. Notice there's no striping or banding in it. As a result, that you have the name smooth, meaning it looks rather smooth, it looks even textured. It doesn't look banded or striped at all. They often occur as sheets where the cells all kind of fit in together. We'll talk more about function of smooth muscle in just a little bit. Skeletal. Looks like I'm out of room here. I'm going to erase a little bit of this, a couple of these cells. Skeletal cells are very large. They are cylinders, very elongate cylinders, longer than I have room to draw on this board. They're very large cells. They are multinucleate. They may have several dozen or 100 nuclei on them. We'll explain how that happens when we get to skeletal muscle tissue later in the course. That's the 3rd unit of the course, the 3rd test. And unlike the previous ones, they have these bands called striations. So it doesn't look smooth, it has a very striped appearance to the texture. And we'll see a picture of that in just a moment. Our final kind of muscle tissue is cardiac. Cardiac cells are forked, are branched. They usually have a single nucleus, and they also are striated, they are banded.
On the skeletal one, what'd you say the holes were on it? Or
These circles are nuclei.
Are they on the
Good question.
are they on the exterior of the cell?
No, they should be in the cell. I just didn't draw them quite right.
Okay.
But when you look at them in the microscope, usually they're most obvious to the side like that. And we're going to see that probably on the picture that they show you.
They just kind of make a bulge, I guess.
They kind of bulge
Okay.
outward, yeah, exactly.
Cool.
They'll look like that through a microscope. You occasionally will see one sitting on the surface here, but often these are often so thick the plane of focus is such that you don't see the ones that are on the top very. You usually see the ones on the side. So they kind of look like that. But I guess the point being they have multiple nuclei. So this is the differences in shape between smooth, spindle shape, single nucleus, no striations, skeletal, very elongate cylinders, lots of nuclei, lots of striations, very obvious, and cardiac. These are the forked or branched cells. Got 2 cells here. They're joined by this is called a disc. I'm not sure if this is on our list or not of things to know, but it's a very obvious structure that joins end to end 2 cells. And again, they have striations, but usually uninucleate, just a single nucleus. Let's take a look at some pictures of these and think about where we might find these tissues in a human body and what their functions are. Smooth muscle tissue. Okay, smooth muscle, we learned before that smooth muscles, here's a real skinny one, they tend to be pointy ends, thicker in the middle. We don't see obvious striations, they look very smooth textured. They tend not to compose entire organs of their own, but tend to be part of other organs, one of the tissue components of other organs. So we see them, for example, in walls of arteries, and in the walls of the reproductive tracts, and the urinary tract, and the digestive tract. Very often parts of walls of tube-like organs. I haven't really said what their functions would be. You might be thinking about what the functions are in these different things, and that might help you answer this question here about smooth muscle control. Is it A, involuntary, that is not under conscious control, or B, voluntary, meaning it's under conscious control, voluntary meaning you can make it contract, you can think to make it contract, or not think to make it contract.
And the specific type we're talking about is
It's smooth muscle.
in organs.
It'll be the same for everything for smooth muscle.
Okay. So,
It would be the same whether it's in the wall of an artery, or like in the stomach or small intestine, or uterus or reproductive tract, or urinary tract.
but it like wouldn't make up like muscles that control your hands and things like that.
That'd be something different. That'd be skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles would, we'll talk about those in just a minute. So I know I'm not giving you a whole lot of information on this. I don't expect everyone to quite get this, and that's okay. Let's see what you got here. What does our audience generally think overall? Most of you picked involuntary, and that's a good choice on that one, because it is not under conscious control. In arteries, basically, it's making the diameter of the arteries, when it contracts, it can reduce the diameter or increase it, and that can increase or reduce blood flow to a particular organ. For example, maybe just after you've eaten, it may expand, allowing more blood to get in the gut to carry all those nutrients away that you just consumed. And there are other places like your digestive tract. It might propel food down the length of the gut or mix food. We might call this movement of food down the gut that smooth muscle does a word that starts with a P. Anybody ever heard that before? Give you a few more letters to that. Peristalsis. Yes, several people said peristalsis.
New one to
But
me.
again, that's not conscious. You can't think to make yourself do it, nor do you have to think. It will occur automatically on its own. Same with the reproductive urinary tracts. Uterus will contract all its own, propel baby out. This is not what you use different muscles when you're told to push to get the baby out. But the uterus will contract to push out the baby on its own. And so women who are actually in a coma or unconscious can actually deliver. They can still give birth because that uterus is still contracting in an unconscious fashion to help push the baby out. Skeletal muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle tissue, in contrast, is voluntary. This is mostly under conscious control. Now again, reviewing the anatomy of skeletal muscle tissue, you're looking at long cylinders. The cylinders here are arranged vertically. So there's like one cell. This whole thing is one cell. This is a second cell right here. This is a third cell. And here we see the kind of nuclei pushed off to the side. Lots of nuclei that involve multiple nuclei. That's typical of skeletal muscle tissue. And we see this banding, this striation that occurs in it. We'll learn why it's banded or striated later. That's a longer discussion than what we have right now, but we will cover that in the third unit. There's a reason for that. We'll cover that later. But this is the one that makes up typical body muscles. They often have their own name. Could be called pectoralis major or biceps brachii or latissimus dorsi, gastrocnemius. All of these muscles that have their own individual name. And for the most part, these are under conscious control. We think about them and they contract or we can stop them. We can stop or start them. Now some things work to some extent unconsciously as well. We've got muscles involved with breathing and we don't have to think to breathe. I mean, that's going to occur automatically. But most of them are under conscious control. They are voluntary muscles. Questions? Last is cardiac muscle. It only occurs in one place in the body, which is the heart. Yes, cardiac muscle makes up the heart. It's the major tissue, not the only tissue, but the major tissue making up the heart. And may be hard to see on this figure just real well, but it does have branching cells, and we can see it maybe in the cartoon interpretation on the right side of the screen. The branching and forked divided cells, typically a single nucleus. We see these intercalated discs that are adjoining one cell end to end. We see one there and there and there, and there's one down there. They're very characteristic of the tissue. There's a certain thing that goes on there that you'll learn more in the heart and cardiovascular system. That's a second semester. We don't cover that one this semester, but you'll learn more about cardiac muscle tissue and the workings of the heart. That's probably about one of the first things you do in the second semester. Question?
How can you tell the difference between the nucleus and the
The nucleus will run at right angles to the fibers. So here's the fibers of the cells right here. So the intercalated discs run at kind of a right angle. They run the same plane as the striations. So the striations run, maybe you can't quite see them from where you're at, but they run back and forth this way here, and so will those. The nuclei tend to be like right here or here. They tend to be more oval things, more or less in the middle of the cell. They're not oriented in the same way. Last kind of tissue, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is characterized by two major kinds of cells, neurons and neuroglia, or neuroglion, singular for neuroglia. Neurons are, in this particular picture, the bigger cells. This big blob here is the neuron. And neurons are the one that conduct nervous impulses. They're the ones directly involved with communication. That is, sending signals from receptors up the brain, or in the brain for processing. Your brain's using neurons right now for processing, sending signals back and forth, or communicating back down your arm into your hand so you can write notes on your piece of paper that you've got there. That's what the neurons do. That's about 10% of all the cells in the nervous system. The rest of them are neuroglia. Neuroglia are helper cells. They help the nervous system. They have a number of different functions. They may store nutrients. They may literally insulate some of the neurons, preventing crosstalk. Just like the insulation and wiring in your house might prevent a shorting or something across. Some of them are involved with producing cerebrospinal fluid. Some of them keep the right kind of environment around the neurons, the right kind of salt and ion concentration around them. Some of them defend against pathogens. All sorts of things that can help the neurons do their function, but they generally are not involved with direct nervous system signals. The nervous system signals, they do not travel down the neuroglia, they travel down the neurons. But the neuroglia are nonetheless important. We'll do nervous system at the end of this semester, and we're going to see that a lot of the diseases associated with the nervous system are often with the neuroglia. Multiple sclerosis, for example, leprosy, or they're associated with neuroglia. Questions? Okay, we're going to skip this one, so it's not going to be on the test. We're going to skip those and not going to be on the test. I've got just a few minutes, so we're going to look through, the rest of these are going to be a number of clicker questions, and we're going to look through a number of different kinds of tissues, and we're going to see if you can pick out what kinds of tissues these are. Let me get off some of these are a little dark, so we're actually going to turn off lights here so we can see these a little bit better, and just see if you can recognize some of these. And yeah, you might have to do a couple of these on the test, not a lot. I wouldn't do very many of these, but I might do a couple of them. Some of these are probably more difficult than what I'd expect you to do, because these are real tissues. Really, to learn real tissues and be able to identify them, we would need to have a lab component to this course where you can actually practice on real microscope slides and look at different things. But if you can get most of these, that's pretty impressive. what'd you pick for this one? Let's see here. Oops, what'd I do here? I did something. Okay, you guys did mostly B. What was B? Blood, yes. You see here on all these cells, these are the red blood cells here, and this is a white blood cell right here. Notice red blood cells don't have any nuclei. They are anucleate. They lack nuclei at all. You'll learn why that's beneficial, why that's adaptive when you get to the blood. Okay, so congratulate yourself if you got blood there. Let's see, what do you think this one might be? It should look pretty similar to the picture we showed you in the PowerPoint section earlier. Okay, let's see what you selected here. And most people pick B. B is bone, very good. You guys are doing good so far. Maybe a slightly more challenging one. And the tissue here is just this tissue right here. There's multiple tissues visible, but just this section right in here is the tissue I'm wanting. This under here is something different, but this is the main tissue right here that we're looking at. See if you can recognize that. A little more challenging. Okay, you guys selected on here, what? Oh, it looks like 2/3 of you picked B. B is the correct answer. Why'd you pick B?
It's irregular.
Oh, okay, yeah, you see all the different nuclei at different levels. They're not really just two levels of nuclei like would appear under a stratified tissue, but you see multiple levels of nuclei. The other thing also is this really obvious cilia. Maybe that's kind of a hint. Cilia can appear in other kinds of tissues as well, but it's particularly prominent and obvious on pseudostratified. It's really the only one that we've looked at that has cilia in it, although cilia can appear in other kind of tissues as well. Let's do one more, then we'll have to quit. I'll do the rest of them during review session. We'll do one more here, and then we'll quit after this. This is a challenging one. Here the tissue is all of this right in here. Key thing, notice these very wavy bands. Wavy dark bands in there. That's going to be the key thing there to identify this tissue. So last one, then we're going to quit. We're out of time. Okay, what'd you pick on here? And you picked elastic. Very good. That is. Those are elastic fibers. That's an aorta.
Sweet.